I am by no means the first person to notice this, nor am I the last person to notice this. But ever since we've been doing polls on the racial breakdown of voters in elections, we noticed that a majority of African Americans back the Democratic Party. I am also not the first to notice that ever since we've been doing the polling backgrounds, the numbers have gotten a bit more steep. Like, take a look at this. The first time that we did polls regarding racial background of voters, African Americans backed the Democrats 68-32. Now let us take a look at the most recent election, 87-12. Some elections, it gets even more lopsided, with the GOP getting single-digit support among black voters. And it is noticeable in other offices too. Of the 168 African American members of Congress, only 36 of them are Republicans. Not to say that black conservatives by no means don't exist, they are just a very noticeable outlier, and as some people have pointed out, do not necessarily reflect the broader opinion of the African American community. But that leaves us with one very simple question. Why? Why do African Americans overwhelmingly lean to the left? With many answers being proposed for said question. And while some of the answers almost reach the mark, I don't think they're necessarily that satisfactory. And hopefully this video will be somewhat satisfactory if you have that same question. To sum it up in a very short and controversial sentence, the left has always stood with African Americans, whereas the right has never done so. Now, to those of you who do not agree with my objectively correct statement, you're immediately going to go into the comment section and type one of two things. Either Democrats are the real racists, or the GOP freed the slaves. I would like to remind you of the United States party switch, another very obvious objective fact in United States history. Back during the 1860s, the Democrats were the ones who were the conservative party, at least for the most part, while the Republicans were very much everything left of center. I mean, two prominent Republican politicians, Abraham Lincoln and Horace Greeley, were literally closely affiliated with founder of communism, Karl Marx. Now, if you're one of those people who doesn't believe in the US party switch and genuinely thinks that the GOP and the Democrats have remained ideologically consistent for almost 200 years, then by that metric, the GOP is a communist party. But this isn't a thing where it's like, oh, they communicated with each other, but it had absolutely nothing to do with politics. Far from it. Karl Marx is actually one of the major reasons why slavery was a hot-button issue in the United States. You see, Greeley had actually hired Marx to write articles for his paper, the New York Tribune, many of which talked about the slavery issue. And since the New York Tribune was a very popular newspaper in the North, particularly among Republicans, that, of course, influenced them ideologically on the issue of slavery, many of which going one step further, arguing that the United States Civil War might have actually been the closest thing that the United States got to a socialist revolution, because socialism and communism were really intrinsically linked to the cause of anti-slavery. I mean, there were a lot of figures within the Civil War that literally were socialists and communists, and when the war ended, they continued their viewpoints through that political action, which became prevalent in Reconstruction-era America, where we got the rise of the first labor unions, the first socialist parties, generally progressive GOP, which led into a lot of social progress and honestly some things that even today might be considered somewhat socialistic. And what was the primary goal of a lot of these left-wing movements? Helping African Americans maintain and exercise the freedoms that they now had. Meanwhile, the right wing in America was doing everything in their power to stop it. Whether it be through political action, through their elected officials that they still had, or through other means. So, when you have two people, one of which is actively trying to help you and make you have a better life for you, your family, and everyone else in your community, or you have people that are either trying to make your life actively worse or trying to make your life non-existent, which side are you going to gravitate towards again? Which, during the Reconstruction era, basically meant that the African American community did not like the Democratic Party. While this mostly meant joining the Republican Party, this also entailed being part of their more radical faction, as that was the faction that was super into abolitionism and post-war Reconstruction. But that didn't necessarily mean that there wasn't going to be some form of tension within the party, because even though a lot of the GOP was actively fighting for African American rights, not all of them were doing it for altruistic reasons, such as the case in 1877 when the GOP literally just decided to sell out an entire generation of African American men in the South for short-term political gain. And if you know about the United States Party Switch, you know that this coincided with an ever so slightly inching towards the center-right. Despite this, due to long-standing wounds regarding racism amongst the Southern Democrats, the Republican Party was still the overwhelming tool for Black Americans to get their voices heard. One prominent African American politician, Robert Smalls, saying after his tenure, "I ask that every colored man in the North who has a vote to cast would cast that vote for the regular Republican Party and thus bury the Democratic Party so deep that there will not be seen even a bubble coming from the spot where the burial took place." With such an impassioned speech about the Democratic Party and wanting to destroy any semblance of it remaining, why would African Americans start shifting towards the Democratic Party? Well, the first indication that things were changing was during the 1930s, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt started to target African American voters with some New Deal policies, building the tent that we all know as the New Deal Coalition, which took the current Democratic tent and expanded it to include voters that probably would have never gone blue in the entire history of their lives. And this is a very ambitious move. FDR is trying to get African Americans in the same tent as people who want to lynch them. How is that going to even be remotely possible? Well, it mostly had to do with the fact that the GOP had become complacent with African American voters and wasn't really doing anything to maintain that vote, coinciding again with a heavy shift to the right. While the GOP still had a very prominent liberal wing, it wasn't the one that was in charge at the moment, and that specific wing was making some very dumb decisions, such as Hoover firing a lot of African Americans in his administration in order to try and win support in the South. Ironic that both Roosevelt and Hoover were trying to snatch up one of the electoral bases from the other side, while hoping and praying that it wouldn't cost them the one they already had, even getting to the point where Black Republican leaders were even becoming complacent and not trying to actively turn out African American voters, assuming that they would just go ahead and vote for the Republican regardless. These factors combined made many African Americans look at FDR and think, maybe something's there, even as FDR was both praising a literal Klansman and helping enact systemic racist policies in the North via redlining. The first prime example coming from Arthur Wergs Mitchell, who was the first Black Democrat elected to the U.S. Congress, succeeding a Black Republican who was already part of the New Deal coalition as he worked to strengthen anti-discrimination laws within the New Deal. As I mentioned before, the New Deal was by no means perfect, nor did Black people across the nation magically become Democrats, but this was the beginning of a trend, and the numbers started shifting towards Democrats. And as civil rights and segregation became a more hot-button issue, the parties couldn't simply wipe it to individual members doing their own thing. Now, the parties had to make official stances on the issue, and while both Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower tackled it, both were coming at it from the liberal or left wings of their party, and would get backlash from both of their party's right wings, albeit one of their right wings was noticeably louder than the other. But, coincidentally, that wing was also starting to exert more political independence, pushing for independent delegates against their party's nominee in 1944, 1956, and 1960, to even flat out running against the party in 1948. So as the Dixiecrats started leaving, black voters started entering, with it culminating in 1964, first with the passage of a Civil Rights Act so ambitious that it is literally synonymous with the term Civil Rights Act, and despite the fact that the president at the time had to do a lot of triangulation to even get the bill passed to begin with, it was still heavily controversial, and many of the Dixiecrats just couldn't back their own party anymore. That same year, a Senate opponent of the Civil Rights Act was also running for president and actively courting Dixiecrat support due to this. But he was by no means a Democrat. And coincidentally, 94% of black voters backed LBJ in that election. And the following election helped solidify that the Dixiecrats were no longer welcome within the Democratic Party. And with that party's right wing now literally being completely severed for the time being, the Democrats had shifted back to being the leftward party, the party of African American civil rights. But the Republican Party would still kind of be close to the center for the time being. That was until the next couple of presidents started shifting the party a bit more to the right, which made their appeal to African Americans shrink a little more. And then the next guy came in and made it shrink more. And, well, I think we could get the picture at this point. But what about black Republicans, I hear you say? I don't know. I mean, there's not really that much of a social trend among black conservatives. And, I mean, isn't that kind of their whole thing? That they are independent thinkers that don't think like the rest of the members of the race? There really isn't that much of a sociological analysis on black conservatives because there's nothing really there. But one that is there is the question regarding African Americans who are beyond the Democratic Party. Socialists, communists, anything further left than them. Well, the answer is very similar to the Democrats versus Republicans history on African Americans, but the difference is in two regards: consistency and the type of support. The Democrats in the GOP will drop and give support basically only for political capital. Why did the GOP become complacent of the black vote in the first place? Because in 1877, they basically traded away the black vote in half the nation for political gain, which is what led to the strengthening and or flat-out creation of Jim Crow. Meanwhile, leftists ideologically seek to break social hierarchies that we currently have, many of which are systemically racist in nature and tie it to a root problem. What was the system that sold African Americans as a commodity to exploit their labor? What is the system that continues to exploit their labor and refuses to give them the benefits they earned? Capitalism. And if they unite with white members of left-wing parties, they could take down that very system. But they don't want to just push that ideology, get support from the African American community, and leave. They stick around for all the issues that plague African Americans. When there was a prominent legal case that had a racism potentially involved, who was there rallying for black defendants? When black workers were being exploited, who was helping them organize unions to fight for their rights? When African Americans were on the front lines, literally fighting for their civil rights, who was there picketing alongside them? And they weren't there to be white saviors either. No. All these struggles were spearheaded by African Americans within these movements. You think white Democratic leaders like LBJ just decided to give African American civil rights for the hell of it? No. It was due to the works of African American figures like MLK, Malcolm X, A. Philip Randolph, Paul Robeson, Bayard Rustin, and the countless other unnamed activists that fought for their rights. Sure, many people in Congress and court systems might have been sympathetic to the movements, but it wasn't until black leftists started making it known that they weren't waiting around that made the sparks of the kindling burst into the fire that would only go out when their needs were met. Fun fact, do you know why Truman and Eisenhower were even fixing the rights of African Americans in the first place? Again, it wasn't due to the kindness of their hearts, it was due to outside pressure. but not in America. It was pressure from other nations around the world who were hesitant to join in alliances with America because America had segregation. Meanwhile, the USSR did not have segregation, which African Americans very much took note of, which of course gravitated them to further left ideologies, and African Americans fit really well with those further left ideologies. Many figures that we know nowadays being a lot more radical than even you might realize. Remember, 1960s, Martin Luther King Jr. was hated across the United States. Now we're at the point where even Republicans claimed to believe that he was in the right. I mean, granted, nowadays we're seeing a lot more conservatives being a lot more mask off, or in this case, hood on. But even then, the fight wasn't just for civil rights and then be done. Martin Luther King Jr. wanted to go further. People forget, when he died, he was fighting for economic rights for everybody in the United States, particularly African Americans, because he understood that just because they were equal on paper did not mean that the root problem was solved. And many others at the time understood this as well. The most prominent ones I can think of are the Black Panthers. And to this day, we still see African American struggles going on. Struggles that, again, one side is openly supportive of, while the other is openly hostile. So I think the question, why do African Americans lean to the left, is really a rhetorical one at this point. So as this celebration of Black history ends, let us not forget that Black history never does. Thanks for watching this video. Be sure to like, comment, share, subscribe, and click the bell to notify when a future video of mine comes out. And if you're interested in more content from me, you can go to our website, follow me on Twitter, join my Discord, or consider supporting me on Patreon.